In the first year of the decline of the human era, people were destined for a difficult fate. Monsters flooded the planet, but people awakened who received great power and, at the same time, people had hope. There were also people who could feel the power but could not awaken. They were also recruited for a carefree life. But ordinary people had none of this. He looked at the beautiful girl and did not understand why he did not find this game before. In the game, he was offered to save the beauty, and the guy agreed without hesitation. The guy's name is Li Yunmu, a high school student, and also an ordinary person. While Li was playing the game, several high school students ran past him and shouted for him to give way to them, because the awakened person's car was ahead. The car of the awakened one was guarded by 2 military vehicles and several police cars. People immediately gathered on the streets to see the awakened person with their own eyes. Everyone was amazed that they could look at the awakened one so close. People managed to see the hero through the car window. Li stood and did not understand why everyone was so interested in the awakened one, so he decided that it was possible to return to the game. Li turned to the screen and said that we should start playing as soon as possible. The game told him to put his hand on the circle to start the game, and without hesitation, Li placed his hand. He put his hand and a strange power began to come from the game menu. Li noticed that his hand was being sucked straight into the game. The girl from the screen said that the download is complete, and the shadow system is officially launched. Li's hand was also pulled inward and he managed to hear only that the game is called a system of shadows. Because of the strong wind and the bright screen, it was impossible to make out what was happening. But after a moment Li noticed something moving right in his shadow. The silhouette of a man came straight from his shadow. Li started screaming because he didn't understand what it was and how it came out of his shadow. The interface reported that the materialization of the shadow is completed. Congratulations on the inheritance of this system. Completing the tasks proposed by the system, you will receive experience and rewards. Li looked at his shadow and thought, is this really the system from popular novels? The interface said that the shadow can only be seen when used, so that it can be used to fight and complete tasks. Li stood and could not believe that this is his evolved shadow and he can control it. Li scratched his nose and couldn't believe it was because he had saved that girl from the game. And then he remembered that there are still a lot of other girls in the world. Then Li started to watch the tasks that were prepared for him. And the first task was to destroy one ant in the garden with the help of a shadow. Li could not believe that he got such a simple task and he decided to accept it without hesitation. Li immediately summoned his shadow and sent it to the park. But the shadow immediately began to decrease and Li could not understand why this was necessary. An ant-sized shadow could easily deal with ants. And then it was the turn of the next ant. Li watched it all and learned to understand what his shadow was really capable of. After a moment, the interface said that the task to kill the ant in the garden was successfully completed. And now there is an opportunity to receive a reward. Li was very happy and started shouting that he certainly wants to receive a reward. A strange aura around Li's body began to flow through his body and glow. He began to feel it, and realized that this is the energy of the flow, and he can feel it. Li smiled because he didn't dare to dream of waking up. But now he has a chance. He looked at his hands and saw how blue energy emanated from them. With joy, Li began to run and shout that he felt the energy of the flow, and he has a chance to wake up. The man whispered to the girl that it looks like this is the one. But apparently he doesn't know yet. The girl whispered to him in response that most likely he really doesn't know, because he wouldn't come here. Li ran to his house, and the man said that the guy was so carried away that he did not even notice that the house was surrounded by troops. Li entered the house as usual and told his mother that he had finally succeeded. But his mother had already been grabbed and she was screaming for Li to run away from home as quickly as possible. Li stood and could not understand why there were awakened people in his house, and why they needed his mother. Mother again started yelling for Li to run, but he couldn't even move. A moment later, one of the soldiers grabbed him and said that no one would run anywhere. The soldier knocked Li down and pressed him to the floor, and then said that they would not let anyone out of the house. Li started yelling that no one would dare to break into their house. The man said that during the mission, Li's father defected, because of which the entire squad was destroyed, and now they are investigating. Li started yelling that his father couldn't do that because his father always protected people and never spared himself, and he would never run away. The man began to say that now there is a regular investigation, and therefore if Li's words are true, then he does not need to worry about this. The man began to say that the mother would still have to go along with the soldiers. Lee jumped up from his knees at full speed. The man could not understand how the gun disappeared from his hands. Lee turned around and pointed his gun at the men, then started yelling that his father was not a traitor. Men began to say that only a person with flow energy could use this gun, and he would not even be able to shoot. But Lee was serious and told them not to even dare to touch his mother. One man started yelling that the transistor had worked and that the boy had to be stopped as soon as possible. But it was already too late because Lee had already fired his gun. A bullet charged with the force of the flow was already flying towards the soldier. The man had no chance to dodge the bullet. The man took the impact of a loaded bullet on himself. Lee thought it couldn't be true. The man just caught the bullet, and Lee finally saw the power of the awakened. The man said that he could not even think that the guy has the energy of the flow, and now this means that they have every right to detain him. Lee began to scream that he would not allow them to take his parents from him and his father is not a traitor. Mom started yelling for Lee to calm down, and he needs to obey the orders of the soldiers. Mother began to say that she did not know that her son had the power of flow, and it was a pity that she and his father would not see him grow up. But he needs to continue to work hard and then he will definitely have a good future. From this day on he must take care of himself. The men started to leave the house and one of the soldiers said that he believed his father was innocent, but they had more points to be cleared up. The soldier said that Lee had a chance to help his parents. Lee turned to the men in tears. The man left the apartment and said that Lee should wake up as soon as possible to help his parents. Lee began to take out the book and realized that he only had a week. Lee took the book and started thinking, because next Friday there will be an awaken test, and it takes place once a year, and there is no way he can fail it. Then Lee asked the system how much experience he needs to awaken. The interface said that 100,000 experience points. Also the owner can reverse the exchange of flow energy for experience. Lee thought that he could awaken if he killed 100,000 ants in a week. The next interface said that the system can work in automatic mode. The user does not need to control it all the time. Then Lee without further ado decided that he could make the shadow fight on his own and decided to turn on the auto mode. At the same moment, the shadow crawled out and began to obey the instructions. Lee sat in front of a book and realized that he could not just rely on the shadow, and therefore he decided that he had to spend the whole week in practice. The more energy he had flow, the higher his chance of awakening. It was just a book about how to feel the energy of the flow. Lee began to remember how his father once told him that his daddy would always protect him. Lee shed tears remembering those moments. His whole body was covered with energy, and Lee promised himself that this time he would protect his father. So 7 days passed, and in the city of Happy Wind, the 16th high school, in the class of the 3rd group, the teacher said that today they should greet the important guests who arrived on the day of the flow check dragon jump. The teacher walked around the hall and said that even if they did not turn out to be awakened, he still hoped that when they graduated, they would still continue to work hard for the benefit of society. And if they could feel the energy of the flow, then they could join the army to fight monsters and become the great guardians of our world. The teacher went to the blackboard and said that if they still turn out to be awakened, then they will become revered heroes, which thousands of people will equal, because only 1 out of 10,000 becomes awakened. But even if you do not have energy, your teacher will continue to be proud of you. The teacher did not have time to finish, but someone had already opened the door to the classroom. On the threshold stood out of breath Lee and he asked permission to go to the classroom. He tried to catch his breath and apologized for being late. After a while, the students took turns approaching the computer and checking their energy. Lee sat out of breath on a chair and began to say that he was lucky that he made it to the last group. Then he noticed that there were quite a few people and most likely they had already abandoned the idea that they could pass these tests. But at the same moment, Lee heard someone call him. Standing in front of him was Faye from the 3rd group, who was the son of the head of a large company in Happy Wind City. And then Faye said that he had already thought that Lee had given up on the idea of passing this test. But it seemed that Lee was so stupid that he still did not abandon this idea. The guys started to say that the whole city is already aware of the crime of Lee's father, and how dare he still walk with his head held high. And does he really naively think that he has the energy of the flow? It seems that Lee is really a clown, since he thinks that ordinary a person can become anyone. All the people in the class started bullying Lee because his father ran away from the battlefield. But suddenly some guy started yelling at Faye, and said that Faye still can't get over the idea that his girlfriend is dating Lee, and he should just go home and be jealous. This guy is Kai and he's Lee's best friend. Kai started saying that Faye should just get the hell out of here. Kai started yelling that just a while ago. Everyone on their knees was crawling in front of Lee. And now when his family started having problems, they came to gloat. At this time, Faye could not believe that this cretin came here. He began to leave and said that soon Kai will realize that there is no point in being on Lee's side. All people began to disperse and Kai exhaled with the words that it is always nice to speak out. Lee thanked Kai for his help, and Kai replied that he shouldn't be nice to him, and asked how his father was doing. Lee said that the investigation was still ongoing and there was nothing to worry about. But at that moment the girl called Lee. The girl's name was Lin. She was the goddess of school and Lee's girlfriend. She asked Lee if he had come specially to see how she would pass the exam. Kai realized that now it was better for him to go away, because he would become the third wheel in this conversation. At this time Lee said that he also came to take the exam. Lin said that she had already heard about his father's case, and although now is not the best time for this, she still wants to tell Lee something. Lin said that a few days ago she felt the energy of the flow. Lee couldn't believe it, but Lee said he didn't care. Lin stood in front of Lee and said that it might sound selfish, but she still wants to fulfill her lifelong dream and see the world. Even if she only has a slim chance, she still wants to go and see the world. Lin started crying and apologized. Lee didn't know what to say, so he just smiled. He stood all alone in the middle of the class and thought that his father's name brought him nothing. Only dogs who pretended to be friends, only pure childhood love, while the situation of families was equal. But now that is not. Lee began to understand that all this time he had not been in anyone's heart. Everything around him became clear to him. And now he began to soberly look at this world. Lee turned away from the girl and said he wished Lin good luck in today's exam. Kai noticed that Lee was going somewhere. Then Kai shouted that he took one place for him. After a few more minutes, Lee was called. He began to go up to the computer and realized that his turn had finally come. Lee went to the computer and pushed the guy away. It was Faye. He was sitting and shouting that Lee was just a jerk who climbs out of line, and why he still did not understand where he belonged. But then Faye calmed down because he saw Lee's determination. Lee waved his hand and began to speak. He put his hand to the computer and said that it was all because he was awakened. Strong pink energy went straight from the computer. Lin was shocked that Lee might actually be awakened. Faye couldn't believe that this guy was truly awakened. Lee became completely covered in strong energy and turned to Faye. He lay on the floor and couldn't believe that Lee was so strong. But Kai came up and tapped Lee on the shoulder and started saying that he couldn't have imagined that his best friend would be awakened, which is very cool. A man from the audience said that from now on, no one would dare to look down on him. The man came up and said that he did not believe that any of the 16 disciples would really be with the power of the flow, and it seems that Lee is really gifted by heaven. Then the man handed him a box and said that this was his sign of the awakened one, and from that moment he will have special rights inherent in Fluxus. Kai squeezed Lee's head even tighter and said that he hoped that within a month Lee would be able to arrive at the Cloud Fort to register, and he also said that the Lucky Wind City Flow Power Master's office would be waiting for Lee. Lee and Kai heard a call from behind. Lin couldn't believe that Lee had become awakened. Lee looked at her and didn't know what to say to her. He started scratching his head and said that he had nothing to say and he needed some time to think. Then he just started walking away and said it might sound selfish, and then he completely left with the words that he wants to fulfill his old dream and see the world. Lin could not believe that Lee sent her away with the same words. After the exam, Lee called his mother and said that he had awakened, and therefore his father would no longer be held accountable. But he still needed the best treatment. Lee lay on the couch and said that everything was fine with him, and you definitely shouldn't worry about him, and asked his mother to take better care of his father. And very soon Lee himself would come to visit him after the conversation. Lee lay and looked at his Fluxer icon. This icon can be used as spatial storage and 3D virtual space. Lee remembered that since he had the Fluxer icon, he could now enter the virtual space. Then the interface informed him that the virtual space would open soon and user verification was in progress. The following interface reported that the verification was successful. The presence of the user right for the virtual space was confirmed and now the download is in progress. Then Lee himself felt like he began to move into the virtual world. He opened his eyes. Lee found himself in an empty room. Then he heard that there was someone there and quickly turned around. Right in front of him were incomprehensible robots. and Li could not understand what they were. Suddenly Li heard a strong laugh behind him and turned around again. It was a huge pink toy dog. Li was surprised again. The toy came very close and said hello. He said that his name was Pedro, and he would be an assistant. Pedro bowed and said that this is Li's virtual world, where he can get a variety of martial skills and techniques, and this is the most important place to grow strength. Pedro started to say that both of them would have to take 2 virtual models. Li said that he was the only one here. Pedro said that Li has a great sense of humor, but he definitely knows how to count to 2. Then Li understood what he was talking about and showed his shadow. Li thought that the virtual world recognized the shadow as a separate person, and therefore it seems that the shadow should be immune to the limitations of a given space. After that, they proceeded to choose a virtual character. Li began to choose clothes for himself. As soon as Li chose his clothes, Pedro announced that since they were ready, he was now officially transferring them to the virtual world. Li began to fall somewhere. Li along with his shadow began to fall at full speed. Then he noticed something below. Finally there is light below. In a moment, Pedro, Shadow and Li were already flying right over the city. In a moment they were able to move on the ground. Li could not believe that such a thing really exists. Li looked around and the whole city glowed with different colors and everything looked very cool. Pedro began to say that time in the virtual world flows 3 times faster, so people in the virtual world have 3 times more time than ordinary people. Li began to say that then it is not surprising that many great people strive to get into the virtual world. While they were standing in the street, the girls started shouting that a person from a noble family challenged Master Gu from the temple of the god of war. Li looked at how the poor fellow was almost killed by strong energy, and was a little horrified. Pedro began to explain that this is a spatial battlefield. The virtual combat system is able to copy skills and abilities. Many people hone their techniques here. Pedro started to jump and said that it was time for them to go. Then Pedro clapped his hands and said that the dimensional battlefield had begun matchmaking. A portal formed right under Li, which began to transport him to another place. In a moment, Li from the city was right in the forest. Weapons began to appear in his hands. A moment later, a sword and a pistol appeared in his hands. But Li could not fully understand why he needed all this. But suddenly he noticed something. He barely managed to dodge the arrow. While Li was bouncing, he noticed that the arrow was also covered with the power of the stream. Then Li aimed at the place where the shot had been fired from. A man stood on a branch and said that Li is pretty lucky. The man stood and looked at Li with such eyes as if he wanted to kill him. Li fired and the man assumed he ran into a noob. The man noticed that this was Li's first battle, and then he said that he could only wish good luck and launched another arrow. Li was able to dodge several arrows with his rolls. The man was surprised by this, but the movements were still very strange. The man jumped off the branch and started shouting that Li didn't have a chance to escape, while Li himself was hiding behind a tree. The man started to load another arrow and said that Li should just take this arrow and they would both be done with these games. A man walked through the woods and said that it was useless to hide. Before he could finish it, Li was already standing behind him and said that he never hid. The man could not believe his eyes. He began to think that he just relaxed. But Li, without hesitation, shot the man with a gun. Li put his hands in his pockets and began to say that even the caged beast would continue to fight, and he should not have relaxed if he was facing a newcomer. Li said that even the ants near the house were stronger. The man's body began to dissolve, but Li noticed that something was lying on the ground. These strange spheres began to rise into the air and glow brightly. Then the spheres flew right into Li's body. He fell to the ground and began to feel that something flew right into his body. Li grabbed his t-shirt and said something was definitely in his body. The interface informed him that the master had absorbed the essence for the first time, and was rewarded with an A-rank technique Admiralty Shroud. Li began to rise from the ground and a new interface appeared, which said that by defeating the master of flow energy in the virtual world, you can get an essence for which you can buy a technique or skill in the virtual store. Then Li thought that it was about ancient martial arts, which people used in the Dark Age. Li's body began to transform and the UI said that with the Admiralty Shroud the damage taken was reduced by 30% and would go up as he leveled up. Li started to think it was cool and he should try out the new skill as soon as possible. Li began to call Pedro, and he was very close. Li told him that he wanted to fight again, And it didn't take long for Pedro to hear his request. A new matchmaking has begun, and again through the portal Lee began to teleport. Lee thought it was rather tiring to fight forever in new territories. But suddenly Lee heard someone asking him if Lee is a rival. When he turned around he saw the girl who was his next opponent. Lee rubbed his head and couldn't believe he was going to fight a girl even though he didn't want to. But he still decided to load his gun, and then fired because if he wants to win then he has no other choice. The girl deflected the bullet with ease. She started screaming that he should be ashamed to sneak attack, even though he is a man. And Lee began to say that he was just going to win, and for this he would use all the tricks. Lee tried to stab with his sword, but the girl jumped over his attack quite easily. The girl suggested that Lee was from ordinary people, but Lee himself did not understand who the simple people were. She jumped already with her attack and began to say that if he does not know about the simple ones, then he is definitely one of them. He managed to repulse the attack and he again asked what this girl was talking about. The girl jumped away. She took a breath and said it's time to end this fight. Her body began to glow, and she began to gain energy. Her eyes were filled with energy, and then she started attacking with all her speed. She very quickly got behind Lee, and cut him very badly. But Lee himself felt pain, only after a while. The girl stood and listened to Lee screaming in pain. Lee was in terrible pain. He could barely stand. The girl already felt victory. Lee stood as if without breath, and the girl could not understand why the fight did not end. She started saying that her technique is called 1000 cuts, 36 forms, and it is an attacking technique of the highest class. She went up to Lee and said that there was no one who could resist. But she noticed that Lee was still not falling and realized that everything was not so simple. And the next second, Lee cut her with one blow. Lee watched her disappear and asked what it means no one can resist. The girl understood something about him and began to speak, but did not have time to say anything and disappeared. Lee stood and understood that he was in a lot of pain, and he himself already thought that he would lose. He continued to stand and thought that this 1000 cuts skill was definitely an ancient cultivator's attack technique. But he was very lucky that his Admiralty Cloak skill took most of the damage. An interface appeared, which said that Lee received 70 cosmic elements and an understanding of the basics of the Blade of Violence technique. Lee suggested that the stronger the opponent, the higher the reward. Lee began to stretch and said that if this is so, then he needs to give everything to the maximum and asked Pedro to start searching for rivals again. Someone watched their fight through the screen. It was a girl and she could not understand how you can lose to one of the simple. It's just disgusting. The girl started to move and said that this Lee encountered such a technique and did not die in a second. Quite interesting. This girl understood that Lee most likely has some kind of strong defensive technique. 3 days later, already in the Sky Cloud City, Lee went with groceries and tried to find a hospital in a big city. Lee was at a loss as to why his father came to the big city for treatment, but he chose the worst hospital for this. Lee walked forward and never ceased to be surprised, because the hospital is located in the wilderness, and in general it is difficult to imagine that they were treated normally there. But suddenly Lee heard a girl on the street asking for help. Lee turned and saw a group of guys telling the girl that they just wanted to talk, but if the girl also had a drink with them, it would be even better. The girl was scared and said that she had important things to do. The guy told her that he knows about his father, who is in the hospital and knows that he needs money, so he will not force the girl to walk with him. He is ready to pay money for it. A moment later, a fruit basket flew into his head. The other guy did not have time to think anything, but his friend was already lying on the ground. Lee came closer and started to say that the guys should find another place to have fun. Then Lee looked at the basket and said that he specially bought everything for his father, but now everything is ruined. The girl looked in horror and understood that a fight was about to begin. Lee held up an orange and said the guys would have to pay for the spoiled fruit. The girl asked how does Lee feel. Lee, without turning around, told her to stand still, because the guys could pounce at any moment. The girl understood everything and continued to stand. One of the guys took out a knife and started yelling that Lee shouldn't have started this because he doesn't even know who he is. But in an instant, the knife flew out of his hands. The guy stood in shock and could not move. A moment later, Lee kicked the guy right in the face. For the next couple of minutes, screams were heard from the alley, with requests not to beat. Lee sat on the beaten guys and looked into the wallet of one of the guys and said that there was just enough money to apologize for the broken basket, so he would take everything and we can assume that they apologized. The guy began to say that Lee had already taught them a lesson and even received compensation, so he can let them go, and even played lifeguard. But is Lee really going to protect this girl all his life? Lee stood there wondering why he was considered a savior. He turned to the guy and said that this girl is his sister. Lee held a pharmacy card in his hands and told his sister that every time they meet, she always has some kind of problem. The girl apologized, but Lee said that this time it was forgivable. If Lee had not stumbled upon them, he would never have found the hospital. The guy gave this card and said that Lee was a student of the flow, and said that if Lee ever needs help, he can contact him at any time. But Lee went to the nearest urn and threw out this card. Lee started to tell his sister that he had heard the boys talking about his sister needing money, so Lee asked if father's treatment was so expensive. His sister's name is Lu. She began to say that her father's injuries were more serious than expected, so almost all of our savings over the past few years were spent. But there is nothing to worry about. The money they have collected so hard will allow him to stay in the hospital for a while. Lee did not know what to answer. He began to scratch his head and said that the father really wants to put Lee in a bad light. Because now you can't find fault with your daughter. She did too much as a daughter. Leave the rest of the expenses to Lee. Because now he is awakened. Now money is not for him problem. Lee sped up and told his sister she did a good job. Lu froze and did not know what to expect from her brother. When they finally got to the hospital, Lee told his sister to go to the ward, and for now he would pay all the bills. Lu went up to the room and greeted her father and mother. The father was lying in bed and began to say that they were very tired of the daughter, because she had to run and fuss, because the parents themselves could not cope. Lu told her father that the issue with the money was resolved. Then the father cheered up and said that he had correctly said that a colleague would help him out and then he would have to repay the debt. But at that moment Lee came in and said that he did not remember serving with his father. Mom and Dad were shocked to see their son. Lee came in and started asking how his father was feeling. But the father said that if his son were not here, he would be much better. Lee couldn't believe his father had said that to him. Father lay and said that you shouldn't make a face, he's fine here, and he just doesn't have legs. Father was really lying without legs and Lee noticed this. Lee stood and could not realize it. But his father said that you should not look like that, as if the meteorite had fallen. The most important thing is that he remained alive, and the rest is a couple of trifles, especially since he was already leaving his. Dad got up and said that such a brat like Lee could not earn money himself, and where did he get the money from then? Lee did not understand such an attitude towards him and asked his father not to talk nonsense. Lee looked at his father and said that he had energy, and now he is awakened. His father immediately laid down and began to ask again about the awakened. But after a second he laughed with all his might. Father started to taunt Lee, because such a fool cannot be awakened, and it is probably difficult for him to even just feel the energy. Lee was just listening to this nonsense all this time. Lee got angry and said that then he would just leave and not come here anymore. His father looked after him and said that he did not know that he had raised an offended boy, and even calls himself awakened. Father began to get some suitcase from under the bed. Then he yelled at his son to take it with him. Lee said that this should be the military weapon that father treasured so much, and Dad agreed. He said that this weapon should greatly increase the combat power of the awakened. Lee turned to his father and asked why he decided to give away such a valuable thing. But his father said that while he was lying in such a state, he would no longer need a weapon. The father looked at Lee and said that the thoughtless use of these weapons is impossible, and an ordinary person simply cannot cope with such force. He went on to say that for the awakened and those who feel the energy, it is of great importance, and in other words, without this weapon, Lee will not be strong, so he will definitely have to use it to become stronger. Lee listened to his father and told him that he would not use this weapon for a long time, and in the end he would return it back, because he would definitely find a way to put Dad on his feet. Then Lee started to activate the combat gear. The suitcase began to turn. Lee shouted for the equipment to meet its new owner. Mom and Dad were shocked that their son was really awakened. The merger went well and Lee was able to maintain the balance. Father looked at his son and said that he was really awakened.